Welcome back to Investing Talk podcast.
Oh.
We love to take these really close looks at individual stocks, and today we're focusing on AT&T. You've probably been hearing quite a bit about it recently, for good reason.
Oh, definitely.
The company's kind of at this interesting point, right? They're balancing their established business
Right.
with the need to invest in new technology, so things like 5G and fiber.
Yeah.
And we're going to take a look at a whole bunch of information to get a handle on this.
Absolutely.
We've got market trends, recent earnings reports, and even what analysts are saying about it. And we'll touch on some of the social media chatter too.
Yeah, social media is always a fun one to look at.
Let's jump right into it. What do you think is one of the most interesting things about AT&T right now?
Well, I think the stock performance over the past year has been really fascinating. It's up over 60%.
It's huge.
It's currently trading at $26.02, which, as you mentioned, really outpaces the broader market and suggests that investors are feeling pretty good about where the company's headed.
So it's like they found this secret sauce for growth that everyone else is missing. What do you think is driving that performance?
Well, their Q4 2024 earnings report definitely plays a big role. They brought in $32.3 billion in revenue, which was more than analysts were expecting.
It's impressive.
It is, and their mobility segment, which includes their wireless services, did really well, growing 3.3% to hit $23.1 billion.
People are still, really using those core services.
Absolutely. It's still a major part of their business.
Now, you mentioned new customers. What's going on with that?
Oh, yeah. They added a really significant number of new postpaid phone subscribers, 482,000 to be exact. And these are the subscribers that are generally seen as more valuable to the company because they're usually on contracts and tend to stick around longer.
Right, so it's not just a bunch of people signing up for a month and then disappearing.
No, not at all. This
Yeah.
points to some real staying power for AT&T.
So they've got all this revenue, new customers are flocking in.
Right.
It makes them sound like a dream stock.
It does sound pretty good on the surface.
But we know no company's perfect.
Of course not.
What are some of the things that investors need to consider?
Well, there was a recent data breach that's always a concern, although it doesn't seem like it involved anything super sensitive, things like social security numbers or financial information. But it's something to keep an eye on. Cybersecurity is a huge issue for any company, but especially in telecom.
Right, and it's only becoming more important.
Absolutely.
Of course, they're not operating in a vacuum either.
Yeah.
We have to think about competition.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Verizon and T-Mobile are big players,
Yeah.
and they're not going to just let AT&T walk away with everything.
So it's a constant battle for customers.
Definitely, the telecom industry is all about staying ahead of the curve and anticipating what people are going to want next.
And it seems like AT&T is trying to do just that with these major investments in 5G and fiber.
Yeah, they're putting a lot of resources into those areas, and it makes sense given how much demand there is for high-speed connectivity.
Especially with so many people working from home now.
Oh, absolutely. And streaming services are just exploding. People need fast, reliable internet. And AT&T is betting big on being the one to provide it.
They're aiming to expand their fiber network to almost 29 million locations.
That's right. They want to be a dominant force in this market.
So it's a really interesting strategic shift. It's almost like they're acknowledging that the future is really about data and connectivity.
I think that's a fair assessment. They're recognizing where the industry is going.
But then they've also had these other decisions that haven't been as forward-looking,
Yeah, there have been some mixed signals coming from them lately.
Like what?
Well, the decision to scale back their DEI program, the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion program, has generated some discussion. Things like encouraging pronoun pins and LGBTQ plus friendly events. They seem to be moving away from that.
And this isn't just happening in a vacuum, is it?
No, it seems to be part of a larger trend among corporations. There's pressure from some groups to move away from these types of initiatives, and some companies are facing boycotts or even regulatory scrutiny.
So it's a really complex situation. It's not just a simple black and white issue.
Absolutely. There are a lot of different perspectives and opinions on this.
It's definitely a lot for investors to think about as they're evaluating AT&T.
Right. It's not just about the number. There are these other factors that come into play.
Maybe we can shift gears a little bit and get into the technical side of things.
Sure.
What are the charts and the indicators telling us about AT&T stock?
Well, looking at the technical analysis, AT&T is currently trading above both its 50-day and 200-day moving averages.
And for our listeners who might not be super familiar with those, What are moving averages?
They're basically just the average price of the stock over a specific period. So the 50-day moving average looks at the average price over the past 50 days, and the 200-day looks at the past 200 days. They're used to identify trends.
So being above those averages is a good thing.
Generally, yeah, it suggests that the stock has upward momentum. We call that a bullish trend.
So the technicals are looking pretty positive, but are there any red flags that investors should be aware of?
There are a couple of things to consider. While the overall trend has been upward, we have seen a bit of a pullback in price recently.
So it's not just a straight line up.
No, it's never that simple.
What does that pullback potentially signal?
It could mean that a correction is on the horizon,
Right.
a period where the price drops a bit to adjust.
So it's like a pause or a breather before the next leg up.
Exactly.
Now, you mentioned some indicators are flashing potential overbought signals.
Right. The Relative Strength Index, or RSI, is one of those.
Can you explain what RSI is for people who might not know?
Sure. RSI is basically a momentum indicator. It looks at the size of recent price changes to figure out if a stock is overbought or oversold.
Overbought meaning?
It means that the price has gone up so much so quickly that it might be due for a pullback.
So like it's gotten ahead of itself.
Exactly.
And what kind of numbers are we looking at for RSI to signal that?
An RSI above 70 is usually considered overbought. Below 30 is considered oversold.
Okay, so it gives you a sense of whether the stock is potentially overvalued or undervalued based on its recent price movements.
Right.
So being above the moving averages is positive.
Yes.
But the pullback and this potential overbought signal suggest maybe a little bit of caution is warranted.
I think that's fair. It's always good to be aware of the potential downsides.
Anything else on the technical side that's caught your eye?
Well, some analysts have pointed out this interesting divergence between the stock price and the trading volume.
What do you mean by that?
Well, earlier this year, the price was going up, but the volume of shares being traded was actually going down.
So fewer people were buying the stock even as the price was going up.
Exactly. And that can sometimes be a warning sign.
Why is that?
It can indicate that the upward momentum might be losing steam. The people who are really driving the price higher might be starting to pull back.
Interesting. So it's like a little bit of a crack in the foundation, even though the house is still standing?
It's something to pay attention to, for sure.
So the technical picture is kind of a mixed bag, right?
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. We have some positive signs, but also some potential bumps in the road.
Maybe we can get a sense of what the experts are saying. What's the overall sentiment from analysts about AT&T?
Yeah, let's see what the pros think. Well, even with those, potential warning signs we were just talking about, analysts seem to be pretty optimistic about AT&T overall.
Okay, so they're not too worried about those little blips.
Not really. The average price target right now is around $27.63, which suggests that a lot of analysts think the stock still has room to climb higher.
So even with some headwinds, they're still predicting an upward trajectory.
Yeah, I think that's right.
What do you think is making them so bullish on AT&T?
It probably comes down to a few things. I think their strategic focus on those high-growth areas like 5G and fiber is a big part of it. Those investments are seen as really important for long-term success in telecom.
Right, it's a bet on the future.
Exactly. And let's not forget about that dividend. It's currently yielding 4.32%, which is pretty attractive, especially for investors who are looking for a steady stream of passive income.
Yeah, that dividend is a nice bonus, for sure.
Yeah.
It makes AT&T appealing to a pretty wide range of investors, doesn't it?
Definitely. You've got your income-focused investors who are all about that steady payout, and then you've got your growth-oriented investors who are excited about AT&T's potential to really capitalize on the 5G and fiber boom.
And how do you think those different types of investors are viewing those kind of mixed signals we were talking about earlier, like the DEI program rollback?
That's a good question. I think their views might differ quite a bit. Some income investors might prioritize that stable dividend above all else.
Right, they just want that check coming in regularly.
Exactly, whereas growth investors might be more willing to tolerate some short-term volatility if it means the company can invest more heavily in those areas that promise long-term growth.
So it really highlights the importance of knowing yourself as an investor, right? What your goals are, your risk tolerance, all of that.
Oh, absolutely. A decision that one investor might see as brilliant could be a complete deal breaker for someone else.
There's no one-size-fits-all approach.
Definitely not. And that's why doing your research and staying informed is so important. You need to understand the market trends, the company news, and even those broader social and political trends that we were talking about.
Absolutely. Before we go any further, I want to take a minute to remind our listeners about something special we offer here at Investing Talk Podcast. We know there's a ton of financial information out there.
Right, it can be overwhelming.
Exactly. And it can be tough to know where to start. That's why we created this show to do the heavy lifting for you. We analyze the data, we talk to experts, and we break down complex topics into those bite-sized insights that you can actually use.
We want to make investing approachable for everyone, regardless of your background or experience level.
Exactly. We're all about empowering you to make informed decisions.
You're glad you're here with us.
So let's get back to AT&T. We've talked a lot about the big picture, but what are some specific metrics that investors should be paying attention to when they're evaluating this stock?
Well, earnings per share, or EPS, is a big one.
And what does EPS tell us?
It tells you how much profit the company is making for each outstanding share of stock. It's a good way to gauge the company's profitability.
And a higher EPS is generally better, right?
Usually, yeah, it means the company is generating more profit for its shareholders.
What about the price-to-earnings ratio, the PE ratio?
That's another important one. It compares the stock price to the earnings per share, which can give you an idea of whether the stock is overvalued or undervalued.
So a high PE ratio might mean the stock is priced a little too high relative to its earnings.
Yeah, that's one way to interpret it, but it's important to consider other factors too, like the company's growth prospects and the overall market conditions.
Right, it's not just about a single number.
Exactly. It's about looking at the whole picture.
We've also got to talk about the dividend yield again.
Oh, yeah. That's a big draw for a lot of investors, especially those seeking income.
How does AT&T's dividend yield stack up against its competitors?
It's actually pretty competitive right now, especially compared to some of the other big players in the telecom industry.
So that's another point in their favor.
I think so.
Now, these are just a few of the key metrics that investors can use to understand AT&T's financial health and performance. But it's important to remember that there are many other factors to consider, and it's always a good idea to consult with a financial advisor before making any investment decisions.
Absolutely. Investing is a personal journey, and what works for one person might not work for another. It's about aligning your investment choices with your own financial goals, your risk tolerance, and your time horizon.
It's kind of like choosing the right hiking trail. Some people want a challenging climb with breathtaking views, while others prefer a leisurely stroll through a peaceful forest. The key is to find a path that suits your individual needs and preferences.
I like that analogy. It's a great way to think about it.
Speaking of paths, let's take a look at some of the broader trends that are shaping the telecom industry right now, a path that AT&T is currently navigating.
Okay, let's zoom out a bit.
One of the biggest trends, we've already touched on it, is this increasing demand for high-speed connectivity. With remote work streaming services, all these data-heavy applications, people need faster, more reliable internet access.
And that's where AT&T's investments in 5G and fiber become really crucial. They're trying to position themselves as a leader in this rapidly growing market.
But they're not the only ones in the game, are they?
Oh, no, not at all. Verizon and T-Mobile are right there with them, making their own big bets on 5G and fiber. So it's going to be a fierce battle for market share.
That's like a three-way race to the finish line.
Exactly. And then you've got this wild card in the mix. Satellite internet companies like SpaceX and Amazon are launching these constellations of satellites that could potentially disrupt the traditional telecom industry.
It's almost like a fourth player entering the race from a completely different direction.
Exactly. They're aiming to provide internet access to even the most remote parts of the world, places where traditional infrastructure just isn't feasible.
It's a really exciting time to be following the telecom industry. There's so much innovation happening. How do you see these trends playing out in the long term?
Well, it's tough to predict the future with any certainty, but one thing is clear: the demand for fast, reliable, and accessible internet is only going to increase.
So companies that can adapt to that changing landscape and meet those demands are going to be the ones that thrive.
I think that's a safe bet.
It sounds like AT&T is trying to do just that. They're investing in the infrastructure. They're expanding their network, and they're fighting for that leadership position in this next generation of connectivity.
Definitely making moves.
But they're also facing those challenges we talked about earlier, the competition, the evolving consumer preferences, and those regulatory and social issues. It's a lot to juggle.
It's a complex equation with a lot of moving parts.
And that's why it's so crucial for investors to stay informed, to do their research, and make decisions based on their own individual situations and goals.
Absolutely well said.
It's been really fascinating looking at AT&T and all those forces that are impacting their future before we wrap up. Though it would be helpful to point our listeners to some resources. Where can they go to learn more about AT&T and do some of their own research?
Oh, absolutely. The company's investor relations website is always a good place to start.
Okay, so going straight to the source.
Yeah, AT&T's investor relations page has tons of information, financial reports, presentations, transcripts from earnings calls. You can even find stuff about their corporate governance there. It's a great way to get a firsthand look at what the company's saying about its own performance and its plans.
That's a great suggestion. Going straight to the source is always a good idea. But what about independent sources of information? Where could listeners go to get a more objective perspective on AT&T?
Independent research firms like Morningstar and the CFRA are good options. They offer really in-depth analysis of companies and industries, so they can provide investors with some valuable insights that are, unbiased.
Yeah. Okay, so you've got these firms with teams of analysts who really dig deep into specific companies and sectors.
Right, and their reports can give you a different angle than what you might find from, company-issued materials.
And of course, we can't forget about all the financial news and information that's available online, places like Yahoo Finance and Bloomberg.
Oh, yeah, those sites are definitely valuable. They provide up-to-the-minute news data analysis on AT&T and the whole market, really.
So it's a good way to stay on top of things.
Absolutely. And, social media can actually play a role too, but you have to be careful with that.
Right, because there's a lot of misinformation and hype out there.
Exactly. Social media can be a breeding ground for that kind of stuff. So you always want to double-check anything you see there with a more reliable source before you make any decisions based on it.
It's kind of like panning for gold.
Yeah.
There might be some valuable nuggets of information out there, but there's also a lot of dirt and debris to sift through.
I like that analogy. It's a good way to put it.
So no matter where investors get their information, it sounds like critical thinking is key.
Absolutely. You have to be willing to question everything you read or hear. That's essential for any investor.
Well, we've explored AT&T from a lot of different angles. Their financials, their strategy, the competitive landscape, the broader market trends, even some resources for investors to continue their own research. I hope our listeners are feeling more informed and empowered to make their own decisions.
I agree. It's been a really good discussion.
It has. We've covered a lot of ground. It's a
Yeah.
fascinating company at a really pivotal moment trying to adapt and thrive in this rapidly changing industry. So hopefully our listeners have a better understanding of AT&T and its potential.
It's been a pleasure breaking down this complex and fascinating company with you.
As always, we encourage our listeners to keep learning, exploring, and staying informed about this ever-changing world of finance and investing.
And we want to thank you for joining us here at Investing Talk Podcast.
If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing to our show and leaving us a rating and review.
Your feedback helps us reach more listeners and continue providing you with valuable insights.
Until next time, happy investing, everyone.